You don't look like someone who can afford first class. Did someone buy this ticket for you? The words sliced through the cabin like a blade, sharp, public, and wrapped in a smile that wasn't kind. Rachel Monroe, a flight attendant in her early 30s with a polished uniform and clipped tone, said it loud enough for half the cabin to hear. A few passengers turned their heads. One even smirked. But the woman in seat 2A didn't move. She simply blinked. Once. Slow and steady. Before we dive in, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments. And if this story hits close to home, if you've ever been doubted or dismissed, hit like and subscribe. Now, let me take you back to what really happened that day on Horizon Sky Flight 322 from Washington, D.C. to San Francisco, the flight where justice boarded quietly, but didn't stay silent for long. She was the first to arrive in first class that afternoon. Not by coincidence, not by privilege, by assignment. Judge Danielle Rhodes, 43 years old, U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Virginia, boarded with federal priority status as part of official government travel. She wore no robe, no badge, just a tailored navy blue blazer over a light cream blouse, wide-leg slacks, and low black heels. Her hair was pulled back into a neat, elegant bun. No distractions, no noise. She walked with the grace of someone who carried not just power, but purpose. A small black briefcase swung from her hand as she stepped into the cabin. Row 2A, window seat. She gave a polite nod to the flight attendant at the door, who barely returned it. But Danielle didn't mind. She'd seen that look before. The flicker of surprise, the way people paused, trying to place her in a box. Too polished to ignore, too black to assume importance. Still, she moved with ease. This wasn't new. What was new was what followed. The moment she took her seat. A ripple went through the cabin. It started with the woman in 2B, Pamela Greer, mid-50s, diamond-studded necklace, a designer scarf tied with casual aggression. She turned and gave Danielle a once-over, top to toe, then leaned in toward the aisle and flagged Rachel, the same flight attendant who would later spark national outrage. She just sat down, Pamela said in a half-whisper that wasn't really a whisper. That's not her seat. She didn't board with us. Rachel smiled, fake and eager. We'll take care of it. That's when she approached, and that's when she said it. You don't look like someone who can afford first class. Danielle didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she calmly looked up and replied, Excuse me? Rachel doubled down. Do you have a boarding pass? Danielle handed over her phone, already displaying the Horizon Sky app. With her name and seat clearly marked, Danielle Rhodes, 2A. Rachel barely glanced. This could be a screenshot, she said. We've had fake tickets lately. You'd be surprised what people try to do to sit up here. Danielle stayed silent for a moment, letting the implication hang in the air. I boarded with government clearance, she said. Pre-check, priority access. My travel is official. But Rachel wasn't backing off. Behind her, another flight attendant, Kyle Peterson, tall, blonde, arms folded, stood watching, not interfering, just silently supporting the hostility with his presence. Ma'am, I'm going to ask you again, Rachel said, her tone sharpening. Did someone else purchase this ticket for you? In the row behind, a young couple, Ben and Amanda Reynolds, recently married and flying to Napa, leaned forward. Amanda nudged her husband and whispered, Something feels off. Ben shrugged. She's probably in the wrong section. It happens. But it didn't just happen. This wasn't confusion. This wasn't procedure. This was profiling dressed up as policy. Danielle took a slow breath. She wasn't just a judge. She was the daughter of a civil rights attorney, the granddaughter of a woman who'd been denied service at a Greensboro lunch counter. She had studied the law, sworn to uphold it, and walked into more courtrooms than she could count, not once expecting applause, but always demanding fairness. And yet, here she was, being interrogated in front of strangers simply for existing where they didn't expect her to be. Pamela turned again, louder now. She didn't board through first class. I saw her. She came in from the back. Kyle spoke for the first time. Ma'am, we'll need to verify this with the gate supervisor. Danielle's voice stayed even. You have all the verification you need in your hand. Rachel stepped away, murmured something into the intercom phone, and disappeared toward the front. Danielle leaned back slightly, not in defeat, in calculation. 7 minutes. That's all it would take. For the whispers to turn into something more, for the cabin to shift, for roles to reverse. She hadn't come to prove anything. But sometimes, life forces you to. And this flight, this crew, this moment, they were about to learn exactly who they were talking to. The minutes that followed felt like hours, the kind where tension doesn't just hang in the air, it tightens around your chest. Judge Danielle Rhodes sat quietly in seat 2A, eyes steady, phone in hand, still displaying her boarding pass and government ID confirmation through the airline app. But the air around her had changed. Rachel hadn't returned, but the message was already clear. You don't belong here, not unless you can prove your worth every step of the way. Across the aisle, Pamela Greer was now leaning back in her seat like she'd won something. Smugness settled on her face like a second skin, and from 2 rows back, Amanda Reynolds watched the scene unfold with a mixture of curiosity and discomfort. It's just a mix-up, she whispered to her husband. But Ben wasn't so sure anymore. He'd flown enough to know that these kinds of mix-ups only happened to certain kinds of people, and they rarely ended quietly. That's when Emily Klein arrived. She moved down the aisle with a kind of purpose that signaled authority, but not grace. Gate supervisor badge clipped to her jacket, a hard look in her eyes that said she already knew who was at fault. No introduction, no good evening, just a statement delivered with clipped detachment. Ma'am, I'm going to need you to step into the galley so we can sort this out. Danielle looked up, calm. There's nothing to sort out. I've provided identification. I've shown my boarding pass. I'm seated in the correct seat. Emily's tone didn't shift. There's a discrepancy we need to address. If you don't comply, I'll have to escalate. Danielle tilted her head. Escalate to what? Emily replied flatly. To airport police. A murmur rippled through first class. The words were chilling. Airport police. It wasn't just about a seat anymore. It never had been. It was about the quiet way power tries to reassert itself when it feels threatened. Danielle didn't move. On what grounds? She asked. Emily flinched slightly, not expecting resistance, not from someone like this. We've had fraudulent boardings before. Sometimes people use screenshots. Or they. Danielle cut in, voice level. And what exactly about me made you suspect fraud? Silence. Thick. Awkward. No one answered. From behind. Marcia James, the off-duty black flight attendant who had been watching the entire interaction, stepped forward. Her voice was measured, respectful. Excuse me, she said, addressing Emily. But I saw this passenger board through the first-class lane with federal clearance. Her credentials are valid. I can verify that. Emily looked annoyed, not relieved. She didn't want clarity. She wanted control. That's not necessary, she snapped. This is now a customer service matter. Danielle turned her head slightly toward Marcia. Thank you, she said softly. Then, returning her gaze to Emily, she added, if this is about procedure, then follow it. Pull the manifest. Cross-check my boarding status. But Emily didn't move. Neither did Rachel, who had now returned. Holding a tablet in one hand and that same stiff smile in the other, Rachel chimed in. We just need to confirm you weren't accidentally upgraded by a third party. These things happen all the time. Danielle didn't blink. No third party. The ticket was booked through the GSA portal. My name, my government travel ID, my account. Kyle, still standing behind Rachel, spoke for the first time in minutes. Sometimes people use credentials they don't fully understand. We've seen it before. Danielle's eyes narrowed slightly. Is that what you think this is? At that moment, Amanda Reynolds leaned over her husband and whispered, She's still being calm. I'd be losing my mind. And Ben, unblinking, replied, That's probably why she's where she is, and why they're reacting like this. In the background, a few passengers had pulled out phones, discreetly at first, but the angle was obvious. People were filming now. The tension wasn't just felt, it was being captured. Danielle tapped her phone once more, pulled up her full itinerary, GSA seal at the top, last 4 digits of the government charge card, confirmation code, status level, seat number. She extended it again. Rachel didn't reach for it. Instead, she looked at Emily. Emily hesitated, then muttered, We'll need to validate this with headquarters. Danielle gave the smallest smile, not amused, but sharpened by experience. No, she said. You don't? Emily frowned. Excuse me? Danielle slowly stood. Her voice remained low, her posture unshaken. You've ignored the boarding pass. You've dismissed the confirmation. You've now threatened to remove me without cause. I've given you every opportunity to correct your error. Emily took a step back. Not much. Just enough. Enough to feel the shift. Danielle reached into the inside of her blazer. Carefully. Slowly. No sudden moves. She pulled out a slim, black leather wallet and flipped it open. There it was. The badge. U.S. District Court. Federal Judge. Her full name. Embossed beneath the seal. Government ID beside it. Federal clearance code. It didn't need explanation. It didn't need defense. It simply was. She didn't wave it around. She didn't shout. She just held it in front of her, like a mirror for the whole cabin to see. The room went still. Kyle blinked hard. Rachel opened her mouth, but no words came out. Emily paled. Danielle's voice broke the silence. I am the Honorable Judge Danielle Rhodes of the United States District Court. I boarded this aircraft under official capacity and with verified clearance, and what I've experienced in the last 5 minutes is not confusion, it is bias, dressed as policy, wrapped in courtesy, but built on presumption. Pamela, now visibly shrinking in her seat, whispered, I didn't know. Danielle didn't even look at her. She was focused now, on the crew, on the faces that had doubted her, on the silence that had followed. I suggest, she continued, you notify the captain. This situation is no longer a customer service matter. It is now a federal misconduct issue, subject to documentation, legal response, and formal filing. Rachel lowered her tablet. Kyle stepped back. Emily didn't respond. The atmosphere had changed again, but this time, it was no longer about Danielle's presence. It was about their mistake. And for the first time since boarding, no one questioned why she was sitting in seat 2A. There's a particular kind of silence that only falls when people realize they've misjudged someone badly. Not just once, but repeatedly, in full view of others. That's the silence that spread through the first-class cabin of Horizon Sky Flight 322 after Judge Danielle Rhodes revealed her federal badge. No one spoke. No one coughed. Even the overhead announcements paused for a moment. as if the entire aircraft sensed the weight of what had just happened. Danielle lowered the badge slowly, tucked it back into her blazer, and sat down in seat 2A without saying another word. She didn't need to. Every eye that had been watching her, judging her, was now watching something else. The fallout. Rachel Monroe, the flight attendant who had been so eager to question her presence, stood frozen at the edge of the aisle, her face drained of all the cheerful professionalism she'd worn moments earlier. Kyle Peterson, still leaning against the bulkhead wall, suddenly looked like he wanted to disappear into it. And Emily Klein, the gate supervisor, the one who threatened to bring in airport police? She had already started backing away toward the jet bridge, murmuring something into her radio with a stiffness that wasn't just procedural. It was panic disguised as protocol. From across the aisle, Pamela Greer didn't speak, for the first time. Her expression had shifted from entitlement to something closer to shame. Her jaw was tight, her shoulders rigid, and she couldn't meet Danielle's eyes. But that didn't stop the damage from settling in. 2 rows back, Amanda Reynolds whispered to her husband. "She's a judge." Ben didn't reply right away. He just nodded, slowly, eyes still fixed on Danielle. "And they treated her like a trespasser." He finally said. Amanda's voice trembled. "Can you imagine what they'd have done if she wasn't a judge?" That question hung heavy in the air, and it was the kind of question no one wanted to answer, because deep down, most people already knew. Danielle didn't bask in the reveal. She wasn't triumphant or theatrical. She simply opened her briefcase, pulled out a manila folder marked USDC Travel Docket Confidential, and began reviewing its contents with quiet focus. But that simple act, returning to her work, was louder than anything she could have said. It was a declaration. "I don't need your approval to belong here. I never did." Still, she knew this wasn't over. Not yet. Marcia James, the off-duty flight attendant who had spoken up earlier, returned to Danielle's row with a respectful nod. "Your Honor," she said softly, "the captain would like to speak with you in person." Danielle looked up. "That's fine. Right here is fine." Marcia nodded again and stepped away. Moments later, Captain Julian Marks, mid-60s, calm presence, a career aviator who had seen the best and worst of people at 35,000 feet, walked into the cabin. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions. He walked directly to Danielle, extended a hand, and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to offer a formal apology on behalf of this flight and this airline. What happened here should not have happened. To anyone." Danielle shook his hand, firm but brief. "Captain Marks," she replied, "your words are appreciated, but I didn't reveal my title for special treatment. I revealed it because your crew refused to believe I was here rightfully, even after I followed every step of their so-called procedure. They didn't doubt my boarding pass. They doubted me." The captain nodded, his face solemn. "Understood. We've already filed a preliminary incident report. I've instructed the team to turn over their logs and onboard camera footage. You'll have full access." Danielle paused. "Thank you. I'd also like a printed copy of the passenger manifest and full names of all crew members involved." The captain didn't flinch. "That's being prepared now. You'll have it before we land." By now. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed from tension to discomfort. Not for Danielle, but for everyone else. Pamela Greer was visibly sweating beneath her scarf. The Reynolds couple avoided making eye contact with anyone. And Rachel? She stood near the galley, speaking in hushed tones with another attendant, eyes darting toward Danielle every few seconds like she was waiting for a verdict she knew she wouldn't escape. One passenger, a man in his 70s seated in 3A, clearly a seasoned traveler, leaned over the aisle and said to Danielle, "They owe you more than an apology. Judge." Danielle didn't respond right away. Then she said, quietly but firmly, "They owe a lot of people more than that." And she was right, because while this flight might end, the pattern wouldn't. Not unless people were held accountable, not just when someone had a title, but when someone simply had the right to be treated with dignity. Across the aisle, Amanda hesitated. Then she pulled out her phone and began typing. A tweet. Something simple. Just witnessed a black woman in first class be harassed and humiliated until she pulled out a federal judge badge. Whole cabin froze. We have a serious problem in this country. It wouldn't go viral right away, but by the time the plane landed in San Francisco, it would already have over 3,000 likes. And climbing. Meanwhile, Marcia returned with a printed folder and handed it to Danielle discreetly. "Everything you requested," she said. Danielle gave a small nod of thanks. "You've been the only one who behaved like this was a person. Not a problem." Marcia lowered her voice. "I've seen it too many times not to know what it is." Danielle looked at her, held her gaze for a moment, and said, "Then you understand why I'm not letting it slide?" Marcia nodded. "Yes, ma'am. And I'm glad you're not." As the passengers settled back in their seats and the crew prepared for takeoff, a quiet awareness settled over the cabin. Not guilt, not quite, but recognition. A truth had been exposed, not just about who Danielle Rhodes was, but about what too many people in that cabin weren't. Brave, fair, it didn't take much to show character, just the willingness to treat someone like they belong before they have to prove it. Danielle put her folder away, leaned back, and exhaled slowly, not because she was tired, but because she was ready. And as the aircraft finally pulled away from the gate, a thought crossed her mind. They still think the badge is what protected me. But it wasn't. It was the law. And I carry that, whether they see it or not. The plane hadn't even left the tarmac, but the damage was already done. First class was no longer a sanctuary of comfort and champagne. It had become a courtroom without a bench, and everyone in it was suddenly aware of the weight of their own behavior. Judge Danielle Rhodes, now seated with a folder in her lap and silence wrapped around her like armor, had exposed something no airline policy could deny, the uncomfortable truth of what it feels like to be doubted, dismissed, and quietly accused, all before wheels ever left the ground. But even as the aircraft backed away from the gate and the cabin lights dimmed for takeoff, the fallout hadn't reached its final verdict, because what had begun as whispered suspicion now had consequences attached. And every glance that once lingered with skepticism now shifted downward in discomfort. Yet the ones who started it all, they weren't just embarrassed. They were beginning to panic. Rachel Monroe, the flight attendant who made the first move, the one who had said, "You don't look like someone who belongs in first class," was in the galley behind the curtain, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to fill water pitchers without spilling. She'd been with Horizon Sky Airlines for 6 years. She'd dealt with irate customers, turbulent scares, even an emergency landing once. But nothing unnerved her like what just happened. She hadn't just made a mistake. She had profiled a federal judge, and now it was on record. Kyle Peterson stood beside her, unusually quiet. He hadn't said much, but silence is rarely neutral, and in the eyes of the law, standing by while it happens is often just as telling. "What's going to happen?" Rachel asked, voice low, lips trembling. Kyle didn't answer, but they both knew. Disciplinary action, internal review, maybe worse if the footage went public. And then there was Emily Klein, the gate supervisor, who was now nowhere to be found. She had quietly stepped off the plane after Captain Marks arrived. Not a word, not a goodbye, just vanished, like accountability was someone else's job. Back in the cabin, Passengers began settling back into their routines. Phones were dimmed, laptops opened, but the mood had changed. Pamela Greer was practically sinking into her seat, eyes darting toward the window like it might open and let her crawl out. No more smug glances, no more comments, just guilt, raw and unpolished. She tugged at the ends of her scarf and stared straight ahead, hoping Judge Rhodes wouldn't say her name. But Danielle had no interest in revenge. Her goal wasn't to humiliate anyone, it was to correct the record and make sure it never happened again. As the plane began taxiing down the runway, Captain Marks made a brief announcement over the intercom. His voice was calm but carried undertones that didn't go unnoticed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. We'd like to remind everyone that Horizon Sky is committed to respect, equity, and fairness in all our cabins. If you experience or witness behavior that falls short of that commitment, please notify the crew or use the feedback form provided in your seatback pocket." A few passengers looked around. Others just kept their heads down, but the message had been delivered. Danielle closed her eyes for a moment and leaned her head back. She wasn't exhausted, but she was disappointed. And it wasn't because of the inconvenience. It was because, once again, she'd been forced to prove her presence in a space she had every right to occupy. She had been pulled from the piece of travel and made into a spectacle, simply because someone looked at her and decided she didn't belong, not based on behavior, not based on paperwork, based on face, skin, voice, presence, being. After the seatbelt light turned off, Marcia James returned quietly with a small notepad and a pen. "Your Honor," she said softly, "I wrote down the exact sequence of what I witnessed, along with the timestamps from the boarding process. I'm not official crew on this flight, but I'm happy to submit a witness report." Danielle opened her eyes. She looked at Marcia, really looked at her, and nodded. "That's courageous," she said. "A lot of people would have just stayed silent." Marcia shrugged, but her voice was steady. "I've been that passenger before. I know that silence doesn't protect you. It just protects the ones doing the harm." Danielle took the notepad, skimmed the notes, and tucked it into her briefcase. "Thank you," she said. "If this ever becomes a case, I may call on you." Marcia smiled faintly. "I'll answer." 2 rows back, Ben Reynolds leaned toward his wife and whispered, "I can't stop thinking about how normal they all acted while they did it. Like it was just another Tuesday," Amanda replied. "It probably was, until they found out who she was." That sentence stung, because they both knew that if Danielle had been a nurse, or a teacher, or just someone's mother on vacation, without a badge, without a title, this flight might have gone a very different direction. She might have been escorted off, or worse, arrested for non-compliance. Meanwhile, Rachel was still in the galley, wiping her eyes with the edge of a napkin. She wasn't crying because she felt misunderstood. She was crying because she understood all too well what she'd done, and what it might cost her. "I didn't mean it like that," she whispered to herself. "I didn't mean it like that." But intention isn't the same as impact. And Danielle hadn't boarded that flight to teach a lesson. She boarded to get to work. But now, she was the lesson. Across the cabin, the energy was different now. Quieter. Humbled. There was no announcement saying, "We were wrong." There were no apologies shouted through the speakers. But that's the thing about accountability. It doesn't always come with a headline. Sometimes, it looks like a passenger putting her phone away, sitting taller in her seat. Sometimes, it's a woman in uniform writing down what she saw. And sometimes, it's a judge folding her hands and choosing not to speak further, because the silence now speaks for her. And so, the plane rose into the sky, and the city faded below. But the story was far from over, because somewhere between takeoff and cruising altitude, the people on that plane realized what it meant to assume, and what it means when your assumptions are wrong. And Danielle? She wasn't angry anymore. She was focused, because this flight might only last 5 hours. But the impact of that moment, of those 7 minutes before takeoff, would ripple across headlines, training manuals, and courtrooms for years to come. Somewhere over Kentucky, with the seatbelt light dimmed and the cabin hushed by altitude, the mood in first class remained thick, not with turbulence, but reflection. It wasn't just that the cabin had gone quiet after Judge Danielle Rhodes revealed her badge. It was the realization that what had seemed like a minor check or mistake was actually a cascade of assumptions dressed in politeness. And now that everyone had seen the truth, that the woman in Seat 2A wasn't an imposter, but a United States District Court judge traveling under official government orders. They didn't know what to say, so they said nothing. But silence, when it follows humiliation, isn't peace, it's discomfort. And for some on that flight, it was just beginning to sink in. Rachel Monroe, who had started it all with that smug line about whether someone bought the ticket for her, hadn't been back in the cabin since takeoff. She stayed tucked behind the curtain, rattled and unsteady, fearing every moment that a supervisor would call or a headline would break. And the longer she stayed out of sight, the more obvious her absence became. But no one missed her. No one asked. Judge Rhodes, meanwhile, sat with a calm that wasn't cold. It was controlled. She didn't look around the cabin. She didn't perform her dignity for the audience that once questioned it. She simply read her files, made notes in the margins with a quiet pen, and occasionally glanced out the window at the clouds sliding past like a world untouched by bias. In front of her, the passenger manifest lay folded beside her tray table. She had already memorized the names: Rachel Monroe, Kyle Peterson, Emily Klein, all listed on the crew log. The Reynolds couple 2 rows behind her had their names too, though she hadn't written them down. Not yet, because while some people had whispered, others had simply watched, and that too would matter when she filed her formal report. Every expression, every silence, every choice not to speak, it all painted a picture, one she knew how to submit, line by line. Captain Julian Marks came out again, 30 minutes after reaching cruising altitude. He didn't bring wine. He didn't come with excuses. He came with professionalism. "Your Honor," he said quietly, so others wouldn't hear. "We've begun internal documentation with operations. I've submitted a preliminary complaint on your behalf. If you'd prefer to handle it formally through your office, I can have our legal team contact your clerk." Danielle closed her folder. "I appreciate that, Captain, but I'll be filing the complaint myself. I want it on record that this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was misconduct, and I'd prefer it handled accordingly." He nodded once. "Understood." Then, with a pause, he added, "It shouldn't have taken a badge for them to treat you with respect." Danielle met his gaze. "No, Captain, it shouldn't have, but we both know that's the only thing that made them stop." As the captain walked away, Marcia James, the off-duty flight attendant who had stood up earlier, returned with a cup of ginger tea. "No sugar," she said gently, placing it on Danielle's tray. "Just how you asked." Danielle offered the faintest smile. "You remembered." Marcia nodded. "I remember the things that matter." Then, she hesitated. "They're saying the video's already online." Danielle looked up. "Video?" Marcia tilted her head toward the back. "Someone was filming when Rachel questioned you, and again when you flashed your badge. It's on Twitter now. A passenger in 3D posted it. Last I saw, it had 18,000 retweets." Danielle exhaled slowly. "And so it begins." She wasn't surprised. She knew the pattern. A quiet injustice, followed by a reveal, followed by a flood of reactions, outrage, sympathy, defensiveness, silence. Then the press calls, then the network appearances, then the think pieces. She didn't seek any of that, but she also didn't run from it. If this moment could educate, if it could change something, not just for her, but for the next black woman who boarded a plane with a seat she paid for, then so be it. Still, it hurt. Not the attention, but the need for it. That. Even in 2025, justice still required spectacle. 2 rows back, Amanda Reynolds scrolled through her phone, saw the video trending, and handed it to her husband. "She's everywhere now," she whispered. Ben took the phone, watched the clip in silence, then said, "Good. Let them all see what happens when they think titles define worth." Amanda hesitated. "Should we say something? Apologize?" Ben looked forward. "Would you, if she didn't have that badge?" Amanda didn't answer. Neither did most of the cabin. Danielle took a sip of her tea, eyes scanning the overhead bins, the gentle lighting, the polished chrome, all part of a system meant to feel expensive, luxurious, earned, but she knew better. Sometimes luxury was just a mask, a space that claimed to welcome everyone, but still expected certain people to prove why they belonged. She reached back into her briefcase and pulled out a legal pad. At the top, in neat capital letters, she wrote, "Airline incident, Horizonsky 322, profiled in first class." Underneath, she began listing facts. 1. Boarded at 5:58 p.m., through TSA pre-check, government security clearance confirmed. 2. Assigned first-class seat 2A, verified via the official GSA travel portal. 3. Questioned by flight attendant Monroe, before her boarding pass was even scanned. 4. Gate supervisor called. She was threatened with police removal. 5. Presented federal credentials. Only then did the tension begin to ease. 6. A witness was present, Marsha James, an off-duty flight attendant. 7. Video was posted to Twitter, verified by the passenger in seat 3D. 8. Captain Marks admitted there was a procedural failure. 9. No apology from the crew, only an internal escalation. 10. Legal Affairs has requested a formal statement. Due by July 15th, it was all there, clear, precise, like any case she'd ever written, except this one was personal, not because it happened to her, but because it kept happening, again, and again, and again, and somewhere out there. A young black girl was watching that video online, eyes wide, heart pounding, wondering if she, too, would ever be taken seriously without having to flash proof of her power. Danielle thought of her, and every other woman who'd ever been told, with a smile, that they didn't look like they belonged. She folded the paper, tucked it into her bag, and leaned back again. And for the first time since boarding that plane, she let herself feel something close to peace, not because the damage was undone, but because the truth had been seen, loud and clear. By the time the plane began its slow descent into San Francisco, the cabin had transformed from a stage of arrogance and ignorance into something closer to a courtroom filled with silent witnesses. No one spoke above a whisper anymore. The air, once full of thin pleasantries and passive judgment, now held the weight of what had occurred and what was still coming. Rachel Monroe had emerged from the galley just once in the last hour, long enough to perform a quiet beverage service and avoid all eye contact with seat 2A. Her hands trembled as she poured club soda for seat 4C, her voice flat, robotic. Kyle Peterson stayed near the front, eyes down, his once straight posture now visibly slumped. He didn't greet passengers. He didn't smile. He was just there, trying to be invisible. But invisibility doesn't erase impact, and avoidance doesn't undo harm. Behind them, The quiet glow of personal screens showed more than in-flight movies. The trending tab on social media now carried a video tagged #first-class-bias and #flying-while-black. Danielle's image, captured mid-sentence, her badge visible, her voice calm but unwavering, had already been viewed more than 2 million times. Local news outlets had picked it up. National blogs followed. Black federal judge humiliated in first class. One headline read, "Crew didn't know who they were talking to." And yet, none of that seemed to please Danielle. She hadn't asked for any of it. She hadn't gone viral. She'd been violated. And no amount of views could return her peace of mind. She hadn't wanted attention. She wanted the right to fly across her own country without having to explain her existence at every checkpoint. But if the cameras had caught the truth, maybe, just maybe, it would force change in places where apologies never reached. Captain Julian Marks stepped into the cabin again as the plane leveled for approach. He walked down the aisle without hesitation and stopped at 2A. This time, he didn't speak right away. He handed Danielle a sealed envelope. "From operations," he said quietly. "They've issued a formal apology, and our legal department will be contacting your office within 24 hours. The crew involved is being pulled from active rotation pending full review." Danielle took the envelope and nodded. "Thank you for your professionalism, Captain. I'll review it after landing." The captain hesitated, then added, "If there's anything further we can do." Danielle cut him off. "Not unkindly. You can make sure the next black woman in first class isn't treated like a criminal before she even buckles her seatbelt?" He nodded, quietly, and returned to the cockpit. A few rows back, Amanda Reynolds had tears in her eyes. They weren't the kind you show when you've been harmed. They were the kind you feel when you've been complicit, even in silence. She leaned toward her husband. "I should have said something," she whispered. Ben replied, "We both should have." And for the first time that flight, they didn't reach for excuses. They sat in it, in the discomfort, in the knowing. Meanwhile, Marcia James, seated quietly now in 5D, opened her tablet and began writing a summary. She'd already sent the internal crew misconduct form through the employee portal. She had the timestamps, the dialogue, the names. She'd been through too many diversity workshops to believe any of this was new. But this time, it had a face, and a title, and a voice that would not be silenced. Danielle folded her hands in her lap, glanced once more at the clouds now giving way to land. Her thoughts weren't angry, not anymore. They were sharp, clear, grounded. She had handled herself with restraint that most wouldn't have shown. But that was never the point. Her calm shouldn't have earned her respect. Her badge shouldn't have been the proof. Her presence, alone, should have been enough. And for once, the world would hear that, not from her shouting, but from her stillness. Because sometimes justice doesn't thunder. Sometimes it sits, straight-backed, in seat 2A, waiting for the landing gear to drop. When the wheels touched down at San Francisco International, the cabin shifted, but no one exhaled. It wasn't just the end of a flight. It was the end of something unspoken, something that had sat in the air like static, the kind of shame that lingers when people realize they've seen wrong unfold in real time, and did nothing. The usual rustling of jackets and seatbelt clicks felt subdued, like passengers didn't quite know how to move yet. In seat 2A, Judge Danielle Rhodes remained still, her hands resting lightly on her briefcase, her eyes calm but focused. She wasn't waiting for applause or validation. She was waiting for accountability, the kind that didn't come in press releases or canned apologies. But in personal responsibility, Rachel Monroe had reappeared at the front of the cabin, standing beside the door like a statue, her smile forced, her name tag suddenly heavy, She hadn't looked Danielle in the eye since the moment her words, "You don't look like someone who can afford first class," sparked a chain reaction she couldn't contain. Kyle Peterson remained silent too, holding the door frame like it might anchor him from the storm that would come when the footage reached the airline's boardroom. Danielle stood slowly, calmly, with no rush, no fire. She adjusted her blazer, lifted her briefcase, and stepped into the aisle. But instead of walking out, she paused, turned slightly, and looked directly at the crew still standing near the galley. Her voice was measured, unshaken. "This didn't happen because I'm a judge," she said quietly. "It happened because you didn't think someone like me could be one. And that's the difference between a mistake and a mindset." Several heads turned. Pamela Greer shrank into her seat, clutching her handbag like it could hide her. Amanda Reynolds wiped at her eyes, her voice caught in her throat, and somewhere near the back, a phone camera silently recorded Danielle's final words. "I don't need your apology," she continued. "I need you to unlearn whatever made you look at me and assume I didn't belong. Because next time, the woman you humiliate might not have a badge to flash, and she shouldn't have to." Then, without waiting for a response, Danielle walked off the aircraft, head held high, posture straight, dignity untouched. Outside, on the jet bridge, a Horizon Sky representative was waiting, nervous, mid-30s, holding an envelope and a corporate apology typed up on letterhead. "Judge Rhodes, on behalf of our executive office, we'd like to express." She stopped when Danielle raised a hand. "Save it for the press," Danielle said. "The people who need to hear it were inside that plane." She walked past without another word, down the corridor, into the terminal. A federal car waited beyond the gate, a black sedan arranged by government dispatch. As she slid into the back seat, her phone buzzed again. Over 3,000 retweets now. Clips from 3 different angles. Hashtags trending nationally. News alerts popping up across platforms. Judge speaks out after airline profiling incident. But Danielle didn't look at the numbers. She looked at the faces of the women on her screen. Black women commenting, reposting, reflecting, sharing their own stories. Quiet moments of being second-guessed, doubted, challenged, erased. This flight wasn't just hers anymore. It had become theirs, a shared, painful, and unrelenting pattern. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror. "Rough flight, ma'am?" Danielle met his eyes in the mirror. "No," she said. "Just another one that started the same way, but ended a little different." 2 weeks later, Rachel Monroe and Kyle Peterson were removed from the Horizon Sky active roster pending retraining and full disciplinary review. Emily Klein resigned quietly before HR completed their findings. Marcia James received a commendation from her union and an invitation to join Horizon Sky's internal ethics committee. Captain Marks publicly supported Danielle's complaint and submitted a 12-page memo recommending mandatory anti-bias training across all senior crew. And Danielle? She returned to her courtroom, robe on, gavel in hand, same steady voice, same clear mind. But now, when she looked out at the people standing before her, she remembered. Justice doesn't start in the courtroom. It starts in how we treat each other when no one's watching. When there are no badges, no titles, no headlines, just 2 people in the same space, deciding whether to extend respect or strip it away. And for those who watched that flight unfold, passengers, viewers, strangers online, they learned something that day. Even if they never said it aloud, you don't judge who belongs by looking at them. You listen. You observe, you ask, or better yet, you treat everyone like they already belong, and let dignity do the rest. If this story moved you, hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share it, so no one ever has to prove they deserve respect.